Somewhere in the last few weeks, you made a decision you would describe, without hesitating, as your own. You chose the work. You chose the person. You chose the city, the schedule, the ambition, the thing you are saving for. Nobody held a gun to your head. Nobody ever does. And that is the part of this that should worry you, because the man we are going to spend the next 2 hours with spent his entire career on a single uncomfortable finding that the wants which feel most completely yours are the ones least likely to be. His name was Erich Fromm. In 1941, he published a book called Escape from Freedom, and in Britain, the publisher renamed it The Fear of Freedom, which tells you something on its own. The American house sold Escape. The British house sold Fear. It was his first book. He wrote it at 41 in English, which was not his first language, and he wrote it while the thing it explains was still happening. Here is what he found, and here is the promise of this video, so you know whether to stay. Fromm identified 3 specific mechanisms by which people give away a freedom they say they want. He called them escapes. Almost everyone who talks about this book gets the first 2 right and then ruins the third. And they ruin it in the same way, by turning it into advice. Be yourself. Think for yourself. Break the mold. Fromm's actual argument is colder than that and far more interesting, and it goes like this. The escapes are not weaknesses. They are solutions. They are intelligent, load-bearing answers to a real problem that freedom itself creates, and they work. That is precisely why they are so hard to see. And the one he considered most dangerous is the one that looks healthiest from the outside. The person with no symptoms at all, well-adjusted, well-liked, competent, going somewhere, whose thoughts and feelings and wants are not their own, and who cannot tell. He had a word for that person. We will get to it. It is not a flattering word, and it is not a word about other people. So we are going to do this properly, not a summary. The whole machine, in order the way he built it, with the biography that made him ask the question in the first place, the suppressed research that made him certain of the answer, the 3 escapes, the experiment at the center of the book that is still the best argument anyone has made for the claim that you cannot audit your own mind from the inside, and finally, the 200 years of religious history he uses to explain why your relationship to work feels the way it does. And then, at the end, what he actually offers instead, which is not a method, and he says so. One thing before we start. This is a video about the psychology of individual people. Fromm wrote it in the middle of a political catastrophe, and the temptation to point it at somebody is enormous. We are not going to. Every time this argument gets aimed outward, it stops working, because the entire force of it is that it describes the normal case, and you are the normal case. So am I. Let us begin where he began, which is with a death he did not understand. Fromm was 12 years old. There was a woman his family knew, a painter, about 25, who was almost always in the company of her widowed father. She was talented. She was young. By any measure available to a child, she had a life in front of her. Then her father died, and within a short time she killed herself, and she left a will asking to be buried with him. Now the ordinary reaction to that is grief, and then a kind of respectful silence. The 12-year-old's reaction was different. He wrote about it decades later, and what he remembered was not sadness. It was a question, and the question was almost rude. How is it possible? How is it possible that a young woman with everything ahead of her would prefer death beside her father to life without him? What was the father to her? That his absence made her own existence unusable. He went looking for an answer, and he found Freud. And that is how a boy in Frankfurt became a psychoanalyst. But hold on to the shape of the question, because it is the shape of the whole book. He is not asking why she was sad. He is asking what kind of bond can be so total that a person's own self does not survive its removal. Much later he had a name for it. He called it a symbiotic relationship. Two people fused into one, each unable to stand alone, the arrangement mistaken by both of them for love. And symbiosis is exactly the word he uses in 1941 for the first of the escapes. 2 years later he was 14, and the second shock arrived, and it was the same question at national scale. The First World War. He watched ordinary, decent, entirely sane people he knew become fervent nationalists more or less overnight. Not coerced, not stupid, converted, certain, and then, when it was over, quietly puzzled at themselves. So the question that runs through everything Fromm ever wrote is not a political question, and it is not a moral question. It is a question about how a self can be dissolved and replaced without the person noticing. He asked it about one grieving woman, and he asked it about a whole country, and he came to believe it was the same mechanism at both scales. Which brings us to the part of this story that almost nobody tells. And it is the part that turns Fromm from an essayist into a witness. Between 1929 and 1931, working at the Institute for Social Research in Frankfurt with a researcher named Hilda Weiss, Fromm did something that psychoanalysts of his generation almost never did. He collected data. He built a questionnaire of 271 questions and sent it to roughly 3,300 German blue-collar and white-collar workers. About 1,100 came back. This was not opinion polling. That is the crucial detail. Fromm was not interested in what people said they believed, because he already suspected that what people say they believe is the least reliable thing about them. The answers were read psychoanalytically. The questionnaire was built so that the political questions and the unpolitical questions could be compared against each other, and the unpolitical ones were where the real information lived. Questions about how you raise a child. Questions about who should decide things in a household. Questions about whether a person in authority is usually right. Questions about fashion, about strangers, about what makes somebody admirable. And here is what came back. On the political questions, the respondents were overwhelmingly confidently left-wing. They endorsed their party's slogans. They opposed authoritarianism in every form the questionnaire offered them. On paper, this was a population that would resist. On the other questions, the radicalism evaporated. not partly, almost entirely. The same people whose politics were anti-authoritarian turned out to hold, at the level of character, a thoroughly authoritarian structure. They respected strength. They were uneasy with genuine independence, including their own. They deferred, and they expected deference. Fromm and Weiss did the arithmetic and published a prediction, and the prediction is the reason this study matters. Roughly 10%, they estimated, would be militantly for a Nazi takeover. Roughly 15% would be militantly against it, and around 75% would do nothing at all. They would go passive, not because they had been persuaded, because their stated convictions were never the thing that would decide their behavior. You know how that turned out. Now here is the detail that should genuinely unsettle you. That study was not published for about 50 years. It sat in boxes. It came out in English eventually as The Working Class in Weimar Germany, long after everyone involved could have used it. So the most striking empirical result in the background of Escape from Freedom is the piece almost no discussion of the book mentions, and it is the piece that gives the book its authority. Fromm is not speculating about what people are like underneath. He asked 1,100 of them in writing before the catastrophe, and the underneath predicted the outcome that the surface did not. That finding is the spine of everything that follows. So let us state it cleanly, because we are going to lean on it repeatedly. Stated belief is not character. Character is what acts. And the two can point in opposite directions for an entire lifetime without the person ever discovering it, because nothing in ordinary life is designed to test the difference. Good. Now the mechanism. Fromm's first move in the book is to change what the word freedom means. And if you miss this move, nothing after it makes sense. We are used to thinking of freedom as an addition, something you gain, a door that opens, a permission granted, a constraint removed. Fromm says that before freedom is any of that, it is a subtraction, and the subtraction happens first. He describes what he calls the primary ties. These are the bonds a person is born into and does not choose. The bond to a mother, to a piece of land, to a church, to a caste, a guild, a village, a role that was decided before you arrived. Fromm is careful here, and it matters. He does not sentimentalize these ties. He says plainly that they block the development of a person's reason and their critical capacities. They are a cage. But he says something else about them in the same breath, and this is the sentence that carries the book. They offer security, and they offer basic unity. In them, a person is not free, and a person is also not alone. He belongs to a structure that tells him who he is, and he never has to construct that answer himself because it was never a question. Every step toward becoming an individual cuts one of those ties. That is what individuation means. It is not a metaphor, and it is not gradual in the way we imagine. Each cut buys you a piece of yourself, and each cut costs you a piece of the world that used to hold you. And here is the asymmetry that the whole diagnosis rests on. The ties get cut faster than the self grows to fill the space. There is no mechanism that keeps those two processes in step. History cut Europe's primary ties across a few centuries. It did not, in the same period, build people capable of standing in the gap. Fromm's phrase for the consequence is flat and clinical. The other aspect of the process of individuation, he writes, is growing aloneness. So the picture is not a person walking out of a prison into sunlight. The picture is a person whose walls have been removed faster than they can learn to stand, holding a freedom they genuinely wanted, in a space they have no idea how to occupy, and feeling something they were promised they would not feel. And if you have ever gotten exactly the thing you were working toward and felt, in the first quiet week after, a specific and embarrassing kind of dread, you have run this mechanism personally. Nothing went wrong. That is the point. The dread is not a sign of failure. It is what a cut tie feels like from the inside. Now, what is the feeling exactly? Because this is where every popular treatment of Fromm goes soft, and the softness ruins the argument. The word people reach for is loneliness. Fromm rejects it, and he draws a distinction so sharp that once you have it, you cannot stop seeing it. He says a person can be physically alone for years and not suffer this at all, provided he is related to ideas, to values, or at least to social patterns that give him a feeling of communion. A monk in a cell is not experiencing what Fromm is describing. A researcher alone with a problem for a decade is not experiencing it. They are held, not by company, but by a structure that answers the question of who they are and what they are for. And then he turns it over, and the reverse is the killer. A person may live among people, he writes, and yet be overcome with an utter feeling of isolation. That is the real thing. Fromm calls it moral aloneness, and he says something about it that sounds like exaggeration until you sit with it. Moral aloneness, he writes, is as intolerable as the physical aloneness, not worse, as intolerable. He is putting a psychological condition on the same shelf as a physical one, and he means it as a description of what the organism will do to avoid it. Because that is the operative point, not that moral aloneness hurts, that it is intolerable, in the strict sense that a person will not tolerate it, will not sit in it, will take the first available exit at almost any price, and Fromm names the price in a sentence that is the darkest thing in the book and the most useful. Even being related, he writes, to the basest kind of pattern is immensely preferable to being alone. Read that again with your own life in it. Any pattern, any structure that will have you, a job that is making you smaller, a relationship where the fights are the only reliable intimacy, an identity built on being against something, a group whose opinions you no longer hold but whose company you cannot leave. An online position you defend daily and privately do not believe. Fromm is not saying people accept these because they are stupid or weak or have not read the right book. He is saying the alternative, an unstructured relation to the world, is experienced as unbearable, and that against unbearable base is a bargain. He backs it with Balzac from a story called The Inventor's Suffering, and the line does exactly the work he needs. Man has a horror for aloneness. and of all kinds of aloneness. Moral aloneness is the most terrible. So now we have the problem in its final form, and the rest of the book is answers to it. A person is handed a freedom they genuinely want. The freedom arrives as a subtraction. The subtraction produces a state the organism will not tolerate, and the person must now do something about it, quickly, with whatever is available. What they do about it is the subject of the next hour. Fromm found 3 things people do. He was clear that they are not diseases, not failures of nerve, and not stupidity. He called them mechanisms of escape, and every one of them works. Before we take them one at a time, there is one more piece of equipment to install, and it is buried at the back of the book in an appendix that most readers never reach. It is called Character and the Social Process, and it is where Fromm explains the machinery that makes everything else in the book possible. Skip it, and the 3 escapes read as a list of unfortunate habits. With it, they read as engineering. The question the appendix answers is the one you should already be asking. If a society needs its members to behave in particular ways, why does it not simply make them? Why is there so little visible coercion in a life that is in fact extraordinarily constrained? Fromm's answer is the most important sentence he ever wrote about how people work, and it is written in the flattest possible prose, which is probably why it does not get quoted. By adapting himself to social conditions, he writes, man develops those traits that make him desire to act as he has to act. Read it slowly. Not traits that make him able to act as he has to act. Not traits that make him willing. Traits that make him desire it. That is the whole trick, and once you see it, you cannot unsee it. A society that has to force people is spending energy constantly and getting friction in return. Fromm says so directly, using work as the example. Were it only that people worked because of external necessities, he writes, much friction between what they ought to do and what they would like to do would arise and lessen their efficiency. The obedient worker who resents the work is expensive. He has to be watched. He does the minimum. He is one supervisor away from stopping. So the solution is not better supervision. The solution is to shape the wanting, and then the whole problem disappears. And Fromm's description of the result is unimprovable. Thus, modern man, he writes, instead of having to be forced to work as hard as he does, is driven by the inner compulsion to work, and then he applies the same move to authority. And this is where it becomes personal. Instead of obeying overt authorities, he writes, he has built up an inner authority, conscience and duty, which operates more effectively in controlling him than any external authority could ever do, more effectively than any external authority could ever do. Think about why that is true, rather than just agreeing with it. An external authority has limits that are built into what it is. It has to be present to see you. It has working hours. It can be deceived, waited out, appealed to, or eventually escaped by leaving. An internalized authority has none of those limits. It travels, it does not sleep, It cannot be lied to because it has access to the same information you do. It is on duty in the shower, on holiday, and at 3 in the morning, and there is no jurisdiction you can move to. Fromm's summary of the mechanism is one line, and it is worth carrying around. The social character, he writes, internalizes external necessities and thus harnesses human energy for the task of a given economic and social system. Now that phrase, social character, needs defining because he is using it precisely. Fromm distinguishes individual character from social character. Individual character is the whole configuration of traits that makes one person that particular person, and if you want to understand a single human being, the differences are what matter. Social character is narrower. It is, in his words, the essential nucleus of the character structure of most members of a group, which has developed as the result of the basic experiences and mode of life common to that group. Not everybody has it. Fromm notes there will always be deviants with a totally different structure, but the nucleus is shared, and it is shared because the conditions producing it were shared, and the point of studying it is not to describe individuals. It is to understand how human energy is channeled and operates as a productive force in a given social order. That is a claim about societies, and it is also a claim about you, because you are a member of one and you did not select your nucleus. And here Fromm makes an observation that reframes something everybody has noticed and nobody explains. He says the character determines the thinking, not only the behavior, and he anticipates the objection, because it is the obvious one. We all tend to share the conventional belief, he writes, that thinking is an exclusively intellectual act and independent of the psychological structure of the personality. His response is that this is simply not the case, and he specifies exactly where it fails. It holds up reasonably well, he says, for the empirical manipulation of concrete objects. If you are calculating a load or diagnosing a fault, your character is not much involved, and the answer is the answer. But the further you move from that toward ethical, philosophical, political, psychological, or social problems, the more your conclusions are determined by the structure of the person doing the concluding. And he goes further. It is not only the conclusions, it is the concepts themselves. Each such concept, he writes, and each doctrine has an emotional matrix, and this matrix is rooted in the character structure of the individual. He names a few: love, justice, equality, sacrifice. Words that two people can use in the same sentence while meaning things that do not overlap, because the word is sitting on a different emotional foundation in each of them, and neither one has access to the foundation. He then gives an example of the historical contingency of all this that is worth hearing, because it does something to your sense of what is natural. Take the idea of work and success as the main aims of life. That idea, he says, was able to become powerful and appealing to modern man on the basis of his aloneness and doubt. It fits a specific condition. It answers a specific anxiety. And then he asks you to imagine that same idea, that same appeal to ceaseless effort and striving for success, addressed to Pueblo Indians or to Mexican peasants. His verdict is that it would fall completely flat. And more than that, these people, he writes, with a different kind of character structure, would hardly understand what a person setting forth such aims was talking about, even if they understood his language. Not disagree with it, not find it distasteful, not understand what was being said, with full command of the vocabulary. That is the measure of how deep this goes. The thing that feels to you like an obvious fact about how a life should be aimed is not an obvious fact. It is an answer that fits a wound, and to somebody without the wound it is not even an argument. Which brings Fromm to the point that connects this appendix straight back to 1100 questionnaires in Frankfurt, and it is the sharpest analytical distinction in the whole book. He notes that ideas can be consciously accepted by people who are not, in his phrase, really touched by them. Such ideas, he writes, remain a stock of conscious convictions, but people fail to act according to them in a critical hour. And then he gives the case, and it is his own case, the one he had measured, before the Nazi seizure of power. The vast majority of German workers voted for the socialist or communist parties and believed in the ideas of those parties. Fromm is explicit that the belief was genuine, and then he introduces the two words that carry it. The range of these ideas, he writes, was extremely wide. The weight of these ideas, however, was in no proportion to their range. Range and weight, two different measurements of a conviction, and almost nobody distinguishes them. Range is how widely an idea is held, how confidently it is stated, how many people will affirm it, how well it polls. Weight is what it will bear when something is resting on it. And Fromm's finding, which he had in writing before the event, is that these two quantities can be entirely uncorrelated, and that everyone measures the first because the first is easy to measure. His conclusion about what went wrong is devastating in its plainness. One mistake of the radical leaders, he writes, was to estimate the strength of their parties only on the basis of the range which these ideas had, and to overlook their lack of weight. They counted. The count was accurate, the count was irrelevant, and he explains why the weight was missing, and it is the questionnaire finding stated as theory. Many of these workers, he writes, were of a personality type, with many of the traits of the authoritarian character. They had a deep-seated respect and longing for established authority. So the actual content of what they had signed up for, the emphasis of socialism on individual independence versus authority, on solidarity versus individualistic seclusion, was, in his words, not what many of these workers really wanted on the basis of their personality structure. They had adopted, sincerely, a set of ideas that ran against their own character, and a conviction held against the grain of a character is weightless in exactly the moment it is needed, because in that moment it is not the convictions that act. Now turn that on yourself, which is the only useful direction. You hold a number of positions about how people should be treated, about what you would refuse to do, about the kind of person you are when it costs something. Each of those has a range, and the range is well established because you have stated them and been agreed with. None of them has a known weight. Weight is only ever measured in the critical hour. The measurement is destructive, and it is taken once. And Fromm adds one more piece, which explains how any of this gets into a person in the first place, since nobody remembers choosing their character. He asks how a child who has very little contact with the life of society ends up shaped by it. His answer is not that parents deliberately transmit social requirements, although they do some of that. It is quieter. The parents, he says, represent in their own personalities the social character of their society or class. They transmit the psychological atmosphere or the spirit of a society just by being as they are. Not by teaching, by being present in the room, having been shaped themselves. And so he arrives at the phrase that should probably be the last thing said before we get to the escapes. The family, he writes, may be considered to be the psychological agent of society, not its enemy, not its refuge, its agent, the place where the shaping happens first, performed by people who love you, who are not carrying out a policy, and who are themselves the product of the same process one generation earlier. That is the machine. Nobody has to make you want what you want. It was arranged much earlier by people with no idea they were arranging it. And the result is a person who experiences the arrangement as their own preference and who is entirely sincere in doing so. Which brings us to the escapes themselves. And before the first one, there is a frame to fix, because the frame is where every other account of this book goes wrong. The word escape sounds like cowardice. It is not being used that way. Fromm defines the three mechanisms with one shared function, and here is his description of it. To give up the independence of one's own individual self, and to fuse oneself with somebody or something outside oneself in order to acquire the strength which the individual self is lacking. Look at the last clause. In order to acquire the strength which the individual self is lacking, that is not a moral failure. That is procurement. The self does not have enough of something. There is somewhere else to get it. The transaction is completed. And Fromm is scrupulous about the accounting. Of submission, he writes that a person loses one's integrity as an individual and surrenders freedom, but one gains a new security. Both halves are in the sentence. A cost and a benefit. He does not pretend the benefit is imaginary, because it is not imaginary. The security is real. The anxiety genuinely goes down. The person genuinely feels better. This is the reason these mechanisms are almost impossible to see from the inside, and it has nothing to do with intelligence. You cannot detect a solution by noticing that it is not working. It is working. That is what makes it a solution. A person running one of these full-time will report accurately that things are basically fine, and every piece of evidence available to them will support that report. So throw away the image of the frightened person hiding from freedom. Put in its place a competent person who found the going rate for a self and paid it, and who would tell you, if you asked, that they got a decent price. Escape number 1. Authoritarianism. Immediately the word misleads, because we hear it and picture a follower, a person who submits, someone weak seeking someone strong. Fromm's version is stranger and much better, and it is his single most original psychological claim in the book. He says submission and domination are not opposites. They are the same structure seen from two ends. Consider what the dominating person actually needs. Not obedience in the abstract, a specific person present whose life is organized around him. Take that person away and what remains is not a triumphant free individual. What remains is somebody in a panic. The tyrant in a household cannot be left alone in it. The boss who requires an audience does not become more himself when the audience leaves. He becomes less. Whatever strength he had was not in him. It was in the arrangement. Fromm calls the whole structure symbiosis. And now the word from the beginning of this video comes back and clicks into place. This is what the 12-year-old was looking at. A painter and her widowed father. Which of them was dominant is not an answerable question and not an interesting one. They were one organism with two bodies, and when half of it died, the other half could not continue. And the will asking to be buried together is simply the arrangement stating its own terms. Once you have the symbiosis idea, you start finding it, and you find it in places that are socially approved. Two people who describe themselves as inseparable and mean it as a boast. A parent whose entire identity is the child, which the child will spend 2 decades trying to survive without being able to name what is wrong, because from outside it looks like devotion and from inside it feels like love. A mentor and a protege, where neither can afford the other to graduate. A believer and a cause. In every case, the same test applies. And it is a hard test to run on yourself. Remove the other party, not from your affections, from your existence. Is there someone left? Fromm goes further into the region we usually label with clinical words, and he insists the clinical words hide the psychology. Masochism and sadism, in his usage, are not primarily about sex or cruelty. Masochism is the drive to become part of something bigger by dissolving into it. Sadism is the drive to become bigger by absorbing something else into you. Different directions, one appetite. And he separates that appetite from a different one with a single sentence that is worth memorizing because it is the cleanest distinction in the book. Sadism aims at incorporation of the object, destructiveness at its removal. That is the whole difference. The sadist needs the object to continue existing. He needs it there, diminished, dependent, available. His whole project collapses if it disappears, because there is no one left to be large in front of. The destructive impulse wants the opposite. It wants the object gone, not smaller, absent. That distinction is going to matter in a moment, because it is the hinge to the second escape, and it is also the reason Fromm treats the second one as categorically more dangerous than the first. But finish the picture on authoritarianism first, because there is an aspect of it that most people miss, and it is the one you are most likely to be running. The submissive form does not usually attach itself to a person. Fromm is explicit that it can attach to fate, to duty, to necessity, to an institution, to a body of work, to an idea, the characteristic move is not obedience. It is the conversion of a choice into a law. Something you decided becomes something you did not decide. And once it is a law, you cannot be blamed for it, cannot revisit it, and do not have to hold it open. Listen for the grammar of it in ordinary conversation. I had no choice. That is just how it is. You do not walk away from something like this. It is too late for me to start over. This is who I am. Some of those statements are true. Most of them are the sound of a decision being converted into a fact, because a fact is restful and a decision is not. And the person saying it will defend the sentence with real feeling if you press on it. They are not lying to you. They are protecting a load-bearing wall. And that is a genuinely difficult thing to hear, so let us be careful with it. Fromm is not saying constraints are imaginary. Most people's constraints are entirely real. Money is real, illness is real, dependence are real. He is saying something narrower and harder, that the mind has a strong incentive to file a decision under necessity, and that it does this automatically, and that the filing feels like clear-sightedness rather than like relief. Escape number 2, destructiveness. Now, Fromm makes a move that separates him from everyone writing about human aggression at the time, and honestly, from most people writing about it now. The lazy explanation of destructiveness is that it comes from too much life, excess vitality, aggression as a drive that builds up and must be discharged like pressure in a boiler. Fromm rejects this completely, and his alternative is one line, and it is probably the most quoted thing he ever wrote. Destructiveness is the outcome of unlived life, not too much life. Unlived life. Life that had somewhere to go and did not go there. That is an aphorism, and aphorisms are cheap. So here is the actual mechanism underneath it in his own more careful words, because the mechanism is much better than the slogan. The amount of destructiveness to be found in individuals, he writes, is proportionate to the amount to which expansiveness of life is curtailed. And then the formulation that makes it a real theory rather than a mood. The drive for life and the drive for destruction are not mutually independent factors, but are in a reversed interdependence. Reversed interdependence. One quantity, two directions. Whatever amount of expansion a life is capable of has to go somewhere, and if it is blocked from going outward into work and connection and making things, it does not evaporate, it inverts. It comes out as the drive to remove. And here is why that theory is so much stronger than the boiler model, and why it explains things the boiler model cannot. It predicts that destructiveness will be highest exactly where you would least expect it, not in the desperate, not in people whose lives are visibly collapsing, because a collapsing life is a life in motion, and it absorbs everything a person has. The prediction is that it will be highest in the stalled, in lives that are secure, adequate, uneventful, and closed, in the settled person who has no remaining project and cannot say so, which is a description of the comment section of the internet, and it was written in 1941 before any of it existed. Look at what the theory actually says about that behavior. the impulse to diminish a stranger, to correct, to find the flaw, to be the one who notices the thing that is wrong with what somebody made, is not a surplus of energy looking for an outlet. It is expansiveness that has been curtailed and has reversed. The person is not full of aggression. They are full of unspent life. And because removal is easier than creation and delivers a comparable sensation of effect, the unspent life takes the cheaper channel. You feel your own force. That is what was missing. You just feel it in the negative. Fromm's point is not that this is contemptible. His point is that it is a report. Destructiveness in a person is information about how much of their life is not being lived, and the intensity of it is a rough measure of the amount. And notice that this second escape is the one that satisfies the definition least well, which is why he treats it as the most dangerous. The authoritarian escape at least gives you something, a structure, a bond, a place to stand. Destructiveness gives you nothing. It removes the world rather than joining it. It is the escape that solves the aloneness by reducing the number of things you could have been related to, which is not a solution at all and is why it never stops. So that is two. A person can dissolve into something bigger, or a person can attack what will not have them. The third one is different in kind, and Fromm says so directly. The first two are visible. Other people can see them, and often the person eventually can too. The third is invisible from every angle, including the inside. It is not a symptom of anything, and it is the one, he says, the majority of normal individuals in modern society actually use. Which means the odds are that it is yours. Escape number 3. Automaton conformity. Here is Fromm's definition, and it is worth hearing slowly, because it is doing something very precise. The individual ceases to be himself. He adopts entirely the kind of personality offered to him by cultural patterns, and he therefore becomes exactly as all others are and as they expect him to be. 3 clauses, and the third one is the trap. Exactly as all others are, and as they expect him to be, not similar, exactly. And critically, the pattern is adopted entirely, not partially, which means there is no leftover piece standing outside it that could notice the adoption happening. The image he uses for this is the best image in the book, and it is worth building in your head properly, because everything after it depends on it. He compares the process to the protective coloring that some animals assume. They look so similar to their surroundings, he writes, that they are hardly distinguishable from them. Sit with what that comparison claims. Camouflage is not a disguise. A disguise is worn over something and can be removed, and the animal underneath knows it is wearing one. Protective coloring is not worn. It is what the animal is made of. There is no separate creature underneath holding the color in place. And the function is precisely that no observer, including any observer inside the animal, can pick out a boundary between the organism and the background. That is Fromm's claim about a person. Not that you are hiding your real self behind a socially acceptable front, which is a comfortable idea because it implies the real self is intact and stored somewhere, waiting. His claim is that the front has replaced the material and that there is consequently nothing standing at a distance from it that could report on it. He states the trade in his flattest language, and the flatness is the point. The person, he writes, need not feel alone and anxious anymore. But the price he pays, however, is high. It is the loss of his self. And then the sentence that makes this the center of the book rather than a chapter in it. He calls automaton conformity the solution that the majority of normal individuals find in modern society. The majority of normal individuals. That is not a description of a subculture. It is not a description of people who are doing life wrong. Fromm is saying this is the standard configuration, the default install, the thing that happens unless something quite unusual interrupts it, and that the interruption is rare. He is including the well-adjusted. He is including the successful. He is including, and he says this explicitly elsewhere, the analyst and the reader. So now we arrive at the obvious objection, and it is the right objection, and Fromm knew it was coming, which is why the center of the book is not an argument at all, it is a demonstration. The objection is this: fine. Suppose all of that is true of most people. It is not true of me, and the reason I know is that my thoughts feel like mine. I can feel myself thinking them. When I want something, I can feel the wanting. When I decide, I experience deciding. Whatever is happening to the majority, this internal evidence is available to me, and it is not ambiguous. Fromm's answer is to show you that this exact evidence can be manufactured in full, in a laboratory, in about 20 minutes, and that the person it is manufactured in reports it with complete sincerity and cannot be talked out of it. He walks the reader through a post-hypnotic experiment. In the footnote, he credits the hypnosis research of Milton Erickson, published in the journal Psychiatry in 1939. Follow this carefully, because every step is load-bearing. There are 3 people. Call them A, B, and C. B is the experimenter. A is the subject. C is simply another person in the room, and A has no history with C, no grievance, no reason for feeling of any kind. A is put under hypnosis and given a set of instructions for after he wakes. He will want to read a manuscript, which he will believe he brought with him. He will look for it. He will not find it. He will conclude that C has taken it. He will become angry at C about it. And the final instruction, he will not remember that any of this was suggested to him. There is no manuscript. There never was one. A did not bring anything. A wakes up. He talks about ordinary things for a while. He is relaxed. He is, to any observer, entirely himself. And then, in the natural flow of a conversation, he says something like this. Incidentally, this reminds me of something I have written in my manuscript. Notice the word incidentally. That word is the entire experiment. It is the sound of a thought arriving as one's own, not as an intrusion, not as an urge, not as something being obeyed, as an association. The most ordinary event in a mind. He looks for the manuscript. It is not there. He becomes irritated. He works out that C must have taken it. He confronts him, and the anger escalates genuinely into open hostility toward a man who has done nothing Now comes the part Fromm actually cares about, and it is not the anger. Begins to supply reasons. He has heard, he says, that C needed material like this badly. He points out that C had the opportunity. He assembles a case, and the case has structure and sequence and plausibility. Fromm's description of these reasons is exact. They are rationalizations. They are all false. And, he adds, they are things A would never have thought of before. Read that last clause again, because it is doing something specific. These are not pre-existing suspicions that the hypnosis released. They did not exist anywhere in A 20 minutes earlier. They were generated on demand after the fact to account for a feeling whose real source was unavailable. The mind was handed a conclusion, and it built the road that appears to lead to it backwards, at speed, and then presented the road as the reason for the journey. Fromm puts it in one line: the suspicion is there first, and the rationalizing thoughts are only invented to make the feeling plausible. They are not really explanatory. They come post factum, after the fact. And then he makes the move that turns a party trick into an argument about your life. And this is the part almost nobody quotes. He asks what happens if somebody walks into the room in the middle of it. A newcomer. They know nothing about the hypnosis. They see a man evidently sincere, evidently upset, making a specific accusation and supporting it with reasons. They see another man denying it. What can the newcomer conclude? Fromm writes their reasoning out, and it is devastating precisely because it is so reasonable. The newcomer cannot decide who is right. There is no test available. Both men are sincere, and both accounts hang together. And so, Fromm writes, since there are two against one, the greater chances that the majority is right. Consensus is not evidence. That is the finding. In the one case where we know the ground truth, the majority position is manufactured and the isolated denial is accurate, and every rule of thumb a sensible observer would apply gets the answer exactly wrong, not because the observer is foolish, because the information required is not in the room. Fromm does not let it rest on hypnosis either, because he knows the objection to that. Hypnosis is exotic. It is not everyday life. So he gives you the other results from the same literature, and they are worse because they get further from thinking and closer to the body. A subject is given a raw potato and told it is a pineapple and eats it as a pineapple. That is not a belief being altered. That is taste. A subject is argued, under suggestion, into the position that the earth is flat, and afterward defends it, and the defense is not a recitation, it is argued. And Fromm draws the conclusion the whole book has been building toward. We can have thoughts, feelings, wishes, and even sensual sensations which we subjectively feel to be ours, and yet they have been put into us from the outside. Feelings, wishes, sensations, not just opinions. Everything you would use to verify that a mental event is yours is on that list. The sense of authorship is itself a mental event, and mental events are exactly what has been shown to be installable. There is no observation deck. There is no part of the apparatus that is exempt from being part of the apparatus. So when the objection comes, and it is a good objection, that all of this may be true of most people, but you can feel that your own thoughts are yours, Fromm's answer is not that you are wrong. His answer is that you have just described the feeling that A reported in exactly the tone A reported it at the moment A was most completely mistaken. And then, having established all of that, he writes the sentence that most people who love this book have never read, because it is not the kind of line that survives being made into a, quote, image, and it is the most extreme claim in it. These pseudo-acts, he writes, are the rule, while the genuine or indigenous mental acts are the exceptions, the rule. Not a common failing, the default operating condition, and the genuine ones, the thoughts that actually originate in the person who has them, are the exceptions, rare events. Things that happen sometimes. You should feel some resistance to that, and the resistance is worth examining rather than arguing with, because it will take one of two forms, and both of them are informative. Either you will want to say it is too strong, in which case ask yourself what evidence you would accept, and notice that you have just been shown that the only evidence available is the evidence that was manufactured, or you will find yourself agreeing with it comfortably and applying it to people you disagree with, in which case you have used a claim about the universality of pseudo-mental acts to feel superior, which is a genuinely impressive piece of work, and exactly the move Fromm spends the next chapter closing off. Because the next thing Fromm does is take the experiment apart into 3 separate territories, and he tells you which of the 3 has been properly explored and which has not, and the one that has not is where you live. The first territory is thinking. The pseudo-character of thinking, Fromm says, is well known. Everybody accepts this. It is now completely ordinary to say that your opinions were installed by your upbringing, your schooling, your class, your feed. Nobody finds this shocking. It is a standard piece of modern self-awareness, and it costs nothing to admit, because admitting it feels like sophistication. The second is feeling, somewhat less explored but still familiar. The idea that a person can feel what they are supposed to feel at a funeral, at a wedding, at a promotion, and that the feeling can be entirely socially issued while being experienced as spontaneous, is not a hard sell. And then Fromm points at the third and observes correctly that almost nobody has looked at it. The same phenomenon, he says, in the sphere of willing, wanting, desiring, the part of you that is not opinion and not mood but appetite, the engine, the thing you would point to if somebody asked what you are doing with your life. Sit with the difference between the familiar claim and this one, because the gap is enormous. The familiar claim is that your opinions were given to you. That is survivable. Opinions are furniture. You can rearrange the furniture, and the room is still yours, and there is even something flattering in the rearranging, a sense of having done work. Fromm's claim is that your wants were given to you, including, and this is the part that has teeth, the want you are currently organizing your entire life around, the career you are 3 years into, the thing you are saving for, the person you are trying to become by 35 or 50, not the small preferences, the load-bearing ones, the ones you would cite if somebody asked you to justify how you have spent your 20s or your 40s, because those are exactly the ones nobody ever audits, since they are the standard the audit would be run against, and you cannot test it by consulting the feeling of wanting, because the feeling of wanting is the thing the potato experiment installed. A person eating a raw potato as a pineapple is not reporting an opinion about pineapples. They are tasting. The wanting is right there, fully present, entirely real as an experience, and completely unmoored from where it came from. Fromm's name for the result of this is the concept the whole book exists to deliver, and it is worth being precise about, because it is usually softened into something far more comfortable. He calls it the replacement of the original self by a pseudo-self. Not the covering of the original self, the replacement. He defines the two cleanly. The original self, he writes, is the originator of mental activities. The pseudo-self is only an agent who actually represents the role a person is supposed to play. An agent. Somebody who acts on behalf of a party not present. The pseudo-self is not a liar and not a mask and not a performance, because all three of those imply a principal in the building who is choosing to send the agent out. Fromm's point is about what happens when the principal is gone and the agent keeps working competently, indefinitely, with nobody to report to. And then the line. For many people, if not most, the original self is completely suffocated by the pseudo-self. Completely. Not obscured, not neglected, not waiting somewhere to be rediscovered by a retreat or a diagnosis or a change of scene. Suffocated. Now, this is the point in the argument where every popular version reaches for the exit, and the exit is always the same, and it always ruins the book. The exit is to say, yes, and that is why you must find your authentic self, and once you do, everything will realign. Fromm does not offer that exit, and it is important to understand that he is not withholding it out of pessimism. He is withholding it because it does not follow. If the pseudo-self is the agent that performs the search, then a search for authenticity, conducted by the pseudo-self, using the criteria the pseudo-self has, arriving at a conclusion the pseudo-self finds satisfying, is not an escape from the mechanism. It is the mechanism running one more time with a more flattering output. And this is exactly why he insists that automaton conformity is the normal case rather than the pathological one, and it is why the honest response to all of this is not a plan, it is a smaller, colder thing. It is the willingness to hold a specific question open without resolving it, which is the one activity the pseudo-self is genuinely bad at, because its entire function is to close questions quickly so that the person can get on with the role. The question is not, who am I really? That question has an answer available at all times, and the answer is always flattering, which is how you know what produced it. The question is narrower. Take one want, a real one, a load-bearing one, the kind you would put on the list of what you are doing with your life, and ask where it came from, not whether it is good, not whether it is achievable, where it came from, who had it, before you did. What you would have to give up believing about yourself if you stopped having it. Whether you have ever once examined it while not needing it to be true, most once examined that way do not dissolve. That is not what happens, and anyone who promises you it is selling something. What happens is much less dramatic and much more useful. Some of them turn out to be yours, and they feel different afterwards, heavier and quieter and more like a decision than a fact. And a small number of them turn out to have been arrived at exactly the way A arrived at his manuscript, incidentally, in the natural flow of a life, complete with a set of reasons assembled afterwards that you would never have thought of before. Now, Fromm does something in the middle third of this book that almost no summary covers, and it is the most original material in it. Having told you what the mechanism is, he tells you where it came from, and he does it by reading 400 years of religious history as psychology rather than as theology. You need to know why he bothers. The reason is that everything we have described so far could be read as a permanent feature of human beings, and Fromm does not believe it is. He thinks the modern character has a manufacture date, and that it was manufactured in a specific place for specific reasons, and that if you can watch it being made, you can stop mistaking it for human nature. The chapter is his argument that the thing in your chest that will not let you rest is not eternal. It was installed in Europe over about 2 centuries, and it is younger than most of the buildings it operates in. He starts in the late Middle Ages, and he refuses to romanticize it, which is the first sign he is doing this seriously. Medieval society, he says plainly, lacked individual freedom in any modern sense. A person was born into a place in an order and stayed in it. There was no career. There was almost no mobility. The idea of choosing what to be was not suppressed. It did not exist as a thought. And then he says, the difficult thing. Although a person was not free in the modern sense, he was neither alone nor isolated. He had a fixed place in the social world from the moment of birth, and that place was not in question. He was rooted in a structured whole, and thus life had a meaning which left no place and no need for doubt. No need for doubt. That phrase is the whole comparison. Not that doubt was forbidden, that the structure did not generate any, because every question that doubt could attach to had already been answered before the person arrived. Then the structure comes apart. Capital, trade, cities, the collapse of the guild economy, the rise of a class whose position depends on what it does rather than what it was born as. And into that, Luther. Fromm's reading of Luther is not about theology, and he says so. It is about what Luther's teaching did for a specific psychological condition in the people who received it. The condition was insignificance. The new economic world had produced a mass of people who felt small, powerless, and adrift in a way the old world had not produced, and they had no way to metabolize it. Fromm's sentence about what Luther supplied is exact. He did more, he writes, than bring out the feeling of insignificance, which already pervaded the social classes to whom he preached. He offered them a solution. And the solution was extraordinary. Not comfort, not reassurance that they mattered, the opposite. The solution was to go all the way down by not only accepting his own insignificance, Fromm writes, but by humiliating himself to the utmost, by giving up every vestige of individual will, by renouncing and denouncing his individual strength, the individual could hope to be acceptable to God. That is the first escape, 400 years early at civilizational scale. Take the unbearable feeling and complete it. Do not fight the smallness, perfect it. Dissolve the will entirely into something infinitely larger, and in the dissolving, obtain a security nothing in the world can touch. And Fromm points out what this cost and what it bought in the same breath, the way he always does. Luther freed people from the authority of the church. That freedom was real and enormous, and the price was submission to an internal master far more demanding than the external one had been, because an external authority can be satisfied and then left, and an internal one is present at every moment, in every room, for the rest of a life. Then Calvin, and this is where it stops being history and starts being a description of your week. The doctrine is predestination. Your salvation was determined before you were born. Nothing you do changes it. And Fromm's comment is a single flat sentence. No doctrine, he writes, could express more strongly than this the worthlessness of human will and effort. Now think about what that does to a person who actually believes it. Your eternal fate is already fixed. It is the most important fact about you, and it is unknowable. There is no test. There is no way to find out, and you cannot stop caring about it because it is everything. That is not a theological position. That is an intolerable psychological state, and it produces a specific behavior, and Fromm names the behavior precisely. What follows, he writes, is the development of a frantic activity and a striving to do something, and then the diagnosis. Activity, in this sense, assumes a compulsory quality. The individual has to be active in order to overcome his feeling of doubt and powerlessness. Has to be. Not wants to be. Not chooses to be. Has to be. In order to overcome a feeling, and then the loop closes. Because if effort cannot change your fate, it can still be read as a sign of it. Success in the world becomes evidence of election, not the cause of salvation, the symptom. So a person works, and the work does not resolve the doubt, because nothing can resolve the doubt. So they work more, and the productivity is genuine, and the anxiety is untouched, and the whole apparatus runs for a lifetime on a question that was structurally unanswerable from the start. Fromm's claim, and it is a big one, is that this is the origin of the modern relationship to work. Not the profit motive, not ambition, the compulsion, the specific inability to be idle, the sense that a day without output was a day that failed. That comes, he argues, from a 16th century solution to an anxiety about a fate you could not influence, and it long outlived the doctrine that produced it, because the doctrine was the reason, but the anxiety was the fuel, and the anxiety did not go anywhere. And then he gives an analogy for it, and it is the single best thing in the book, and almost nobody quotes it. Picture a person waiting for a medical result, something serious. The test has been done, the answer exists, it is written down somewhere, and it will arrive in the afternoon. There is nothing that can be done about it. Whatever it says, it already says. Fromm observes that such a person quite naturally is in a state of anxiety, and then he makes the observation that turns the analogy into a scalpel. Usually, he writes, he will not sit down quietly and wait. He paces. He telephones people for no reason. He talks to anyone he can get hold of, and then Fromm lists what else he does, and the specificity of the list is what makes it land. He cleans up his desk. He writes letters. He goes at his ordinary work with added activity and more feverishly. Read that list again and notice what is on it. Not distractions, not entertainment, not anything a person would be embarrassed by. He tidies, he corresponds, he works harder than usual. That is Fromm's picture of the modern career, and it is not a joke and not a cheap shot. It is a structural claim. The behavior of the man in the waiting room and the behavior of the person who cannot stop working are the same behavior, produced by the same mechanism, and they are indistinguishable from outside and from inside. In both cases, activity is not aimed at a result. It is aimed at a feeling. It is what a body does with an anxiety it cannot discharge and cannot examine, and it is chosen precisely because it is legible as virtue. And the reason this is so difficult to see in yourself is that the output is real, the desk really is tidier, the letters really do get written. The work is genuinely done and is often genuinely good, and every external measure confirms that a productive person is being productive. There is no failure anywhere in the picture. That is why nobody looks. The test Fromm's analysis suggests is uncomfortable, and it is not about how hard you work. It is about what happens when you stop. If a day with nothing in it produces relief, the activity was aimed at a result. If a day with nothing in it produces a low, formless dread that arrives around the middle of the afternoon and that you would find hard to name, then the activity was doing a different job and the job was not the work. Now, Fromm turns from the historical machinery to two concepts that land directly on a modern life. And the first of them is the strangest thing in the book. He calls it the magic helper. He describes a kind of person whose whole life, in a subtle way, is related to some power outside themselves. Not worship, nothing so explicit. His description of the relationship is 3 verbs, and they are all quiet. They expect protection from him. They wish to be taken care of by him. They make him also responsible for whatever may be the outcome of their own actions. And Fromm notes 2 things about this figure that make it hard to catch. It is usually unrecognized by the person, and it is often faceless. There is frequently no specific individual who is the magic helper. There is only the persistent, unexamined sense that somewhere there is a power that is going to intervene, and that one's own actions are therefore not the final word on one's own life. Listen for the shape of it, the sense that at some point you will be found, that someone will eventually see what you are capable of, that the right situation, the right teacher, the right partner, the right opportunity is going to arrive and make the difference that your own effort has not made. That there is a version of your life that begins when something external finally happens. None of these are stupid thoughts. Most of them are socially encouraged, and every one of them relocates responsibility for the outcome to a party who has not agreed to it, which is the exact function Fromm describes. And then he does the thing that makes this a genuinely uncomfortable book. He turns it on romantic love. The personification of the magic helper, he writes, is to be observed frequently in what is called falling in love. He is not being cynical, and it matters that you hear the argument rather than the tone. His claim is not that love is fake. It is that a specific and extremely common experience, which we call falling in love, is in a large number of cases the successful location of a magic helper. The intensity is real. The relief is real. The sense of having found the person is real. What is happening underneath is that a self which cannot stand alone has found somewhere to attach, and the attachment has produced an enormous and entirely genuine emotional event. And then he adds the detail that makes it airtight, and it is the kind of detail only a clinician would think of. When the other person is doing exactly the same thing in the other direction, the mutuality of it only helps to strengthen the impression that this relationship is one of real love. Two people, each of whom has found a magic helper in the other, will produce between them a perfectly symmetrical, mutually confirming, overwhelming certainty. Each one's intensity is evidence to the other. Nothing about the situation could feel more like being right. His proof is clinical, and it is hard to argue with. In analysis, Fromm points out, the most different kinds of persons develop the same feelings toward the most different kinds of analysts. If the intensity of the attachment were about the particular qualities of the particular person, that could not happen. The uniformity of the response across wildly different objects tells you that the response was not caused by the object, it was waiting for one. And here is where I want to be careful, because this is exactly the kind of idea that gets weaponized. Fromm is not giving you a tool for diagnosing other people's marriages. He is not even saying that a relationship which began this way is doomed. He is saying that there is a difference between a bond in which two people are relating and a bond in which two people are being held up, that the second is far more common, that from inside it feels stronger rather than weaker, and that the way you find out which one you have is not by examining the feeling. The second concept is quieter, and it may be the most modern thing in the entire book. Fromm calls it anonymous authority. The history goes like this. Authority used to be visible. It had a name, a face, a title, and a location. A father, a priest, a lord, a magistrate, and a visible authority has a specific property that is easy to overlook. It can be disobeyed. You may not survive disobeying it, but the act is available. The command is a command, the commander is a person, and the relationship between them and you is legible to everyone, including you. Anonymous authority has none of that. The command and the commander have both dissolved into the background. Authority now arrives wearing the clothes of common sense, of science, of normality, of mental health, of public opinion, of what everybody knows, of what the market has decided, of what reasonable people do. And here is the property that makes it so much more effective than the old kind. Nothing is ordered. so nothing can be disobeyed. There is no command to refuse, because nothing presents itself as a command. There is only a shape the world has, and the shape has no author, and things that have no author cannot be resisted, only failed at. Consider what happens to a person who does not conform to a visible authority. They are a rebel. That is a recognized position with a history and a dignity and, importantly, an audience. Now consider what happens to a person who does not conform to anonymous authority. They are not a rebel. There was nothing to rebel against. They are just a bit odd, behind, unrealistic, a little difficult, possibly unwell. There is no confrontation to have, because there is no one on the other side of it, and the pressure to return is not applied by anybody in particular. It is simply the ambient condition of every room they enter. Fromm raises this in Escape from Freedom and develops it properly in two later books, Man for Himself in 1947 and The Sane Society in 1955. So if you go looking, that is where the full treatment lives. But the seed is here, and the seed is enough. The most complete form of control is the form that does not know it is control, that nobody is administering, and that presents itself to the person as their own good judgment. And to see how early he saw this, look at what he does next. Because in 1941, before television, he writes several pages about advertising that read as though they were written this year. He is not complaining that advertisements are annoying. His claim is technical, and it is an accusation. Modern advertising, he writes, does not appeal to reason but to emotion. And then the comparison that gives it teeth. Like any other kind of hypnoid suggestion, it tries to impress its objects emotionally and then make them submit intellectually. Hypnoid. He is deliberately linking it back to the experiment at the center of the book. Impress emotionally, then obtain intellectual submission. Feeling first, reasons afterward. That is the structure of A and the manuscript sold as a service. Then he lists the techniques, and the list is uncannily current, the endless repetition of a formula, the use of an authoritative image to transfer credibility, and his examples are period pieces that map perfectly onto now the society lady and the famous boxer endorsing a brand of cigarette. The weakening of critical capacity through sex appeal, terrorizing the customer with the threat of a personal defect, and here his example is bad breath, which is exactly the sort of manufactured shame that a whole industry still runs on. And the daydream, the promise that an entire life can change on the purchase of a shirt or a bar of soap. His verdict on all of it is uncompromising. These methods, he writes, smother and kill the critical capacities of the customer like an opiate. And then, a sentence that would still start an argument. They are, he says, more dangerous to our democracy than many of the open attacks against it. Understand the logic of that claim, because it is not hyperbole and it is not really about advertising. An open attack on people's freedom to think leaves the capacity to think intact and merely opposes it, which means the capacity is still there to be defended. What Fromm is describing does something different. It operates on the faculty itself, It trains a population daily in accepting conclusions that arrive with a feeling attached and reasons supplied afterward, until that sequence stops registering as unusual and starts registering as thinking. Which brings us back to where the argument has been heading the whole time. Every mechanism in this book has the same signature. The person is not overpowered, the person is supplied. And what they are supplied with is not a belief but a procedure. The procedure by which a feeling gets a reason, and once that procedure is running, no particular belief needs to be installed, because the person will manufacture whichever ones the situation requires and will experience each one as their own conclusion. So the question of what to do about it cannot be a question about which beliefs to hold. That is the wrong layer, and Fromm knows it. Which is why the last part of the book is so much stranger and so much smaller than people expect. Fromm's answer is one word, and the word has been so thoroughly ruined by the centuries since he used it that we need to spend some time repairing it before it can carry any weight. The word is spontaneity. Now, what that word means today is roughly the opposite of what he meant. Today, it means impulsiveness, doing the unplanned thing, saying yes to the trip, following the whim, a quality that lives in the small hours and the unscheduled weekend. And that is understood as a pleasant break from your actual life, rather than as anything structural. Fromm goes to the Latin, and the Latin is the whole argument. Sponte, of one's free will, not unplanned, not impulsive, originating in the person. That is the entire content of the word. A spontaneous act, in Fromm's sense, is one whose author is the person performing it, and it can be an act that took 9 years and a great deal of paperwork, and he defines it, characteristically, by ruling out the two things it is most often confused with, and both exclusions are pointed. Spontaneous activity is not compulsive activity. There goes the man in the waiting room. Everything Calvin built is disqualified in 4 words. The frantic striving, the desk that gets tidied, the feverish extra work, none of it counts. No matter how much of it there is and no matter how good the results are, because its author is an anxiety rather than a person. And it is not the activity of the automaton, which is the uncritical adoption of patterns suggested from the outside. There goes the third escape. The life that is being lived correctly, on the pattern, at the expected pace, does not count either, however well it is going. Between those two exclusions there is not much room left, and that is deliberate. Fromm has just disqualified the two modes that between them account for most of what most people do most of the time, and he is not embarrassed about it. What is left is narrower than a lifestyle. It is closer to a category of moment, and he names the precondition, which is the part that stops this from being a pep talk. Spontaneity is not something you can decide to have on Monday. It has a requirement, and the requirement is structural. It is possible, he writes, only if man does not repress essential parts of his self, only if he has become transparent to himself. Transparent to himself. Not improved, not healed, not fixed, able to see through without the interruption of the parts that have been walled off and are no longer available for inspection. And that reframes the whole problem in a way that is worth stopping on. The obstacle to spontaneity is not a lack of courage or energy or permission. It is that a person who has repressed essential parts of themselves has, by that fact, lost the ability to tell where their own acts are coming from. Not the ability to act, the ability to locate the origin, which means the pseudo-self is not primarily a moral condition. It is an epistemic one. It is what it is like to be a system that cannot read its own inputs. So where does Fromm actually see spontaneity? He gives 3 places, and the 3 of them together tell you exactly how modest and how radical the claim is. The first is artists, and he is careful about which sense of the word he means, because it is not the romantic one. He notes that Balzac defined an artist in precisely this way, as a person whose activity originates in themselves rather than being copied or commissioned from outside. The point is not that painters are free people. The point is that the artist is the culture's one openly acknowledged example of a person whose output is supposed to come from them, and that we find this so remarkable that we built an entire social category around it. The second is small children. And this is where Fromm says something genuinely surprising, because he is not being sentimental. He observes that children have an ability to feel and think that which is really theirs. And then he makes an argument about why we like them, and it is not the argument anyone expects. We usually explain our response to children by their innocence, their smallness, their need. Fromm says no. That, he argues, is the real reason we find them attractive, not innocence. Originality, in the literal sense. When a child tells you what they think about something, the thought started in them. You are in the presence of the thing you almost never encounter, and the pleasure you feel has a component in it that is closer to relief than to tenderness. And then he makes the point that gives the observation its edge, which is that this capacity is not preserved, it is trained out, not by cruelty, in most cases, and not by anything anyone would recognize as harm. It is trained out by the ordinary, reasonable, well-intentioned business of teaching a person what to feel and think in order to be acceptable, which is what raising a child largely consists of and cannot avoid consisting of. The third place is the one that matters most, because it is available to everyone listening to this, and it is the reason the argument does not collapse into despair. He points at ordinary moments, and his examples are so plain that you can miss what he is doing with them. The fresh and spontaneous perception of a landscape, the dawning of some truth as the result of our own thinking, the welling up of love for another person. Look at what those 3 have in common. Each is a moment in which something arrives that was not issued, not the enjoyment of a view you have been told is beautiful, but the perception of one firsthand before the label lands. Not the acceptance of a true statement, but the arrival of a truth as a result of your own thinking, which has a specific and unmistakable feel to it and cannot be manufactured on demand. Not the performance of love, but the welling up of it. They are small, they are brief, and they cannot be scheduled. And Fromm's claim is that these are not the pleasant edges of an otherwise mechanical life. They are the entire evidence that there is somebody home. They are the exceptions he referred to when he said the genuine mental acts are the exceptions. And here he is telling you what the exceptions look like from inside so that you can recognize one when it happens, which is the only practical instruction in the book. And then he names the two components that a life built on this would actually run on, and they are, disappointingly and correctly, the two oldest words in the subject, love and work, but he defines both so precisely that they stop being platitudes. Love, in his definition, is the spontaneous affirmation of others on the basis of the preservation of the individual self. Read the second clause twice, because it is the whole thing, and it is the clause that rules out almost everything we have discussed on the basis of the preservation of the individual self. Not the dissolution of it, not the fusion, not the symbiosis of the painter and her father, not the mutual magic helper arrangement in which two people hold each other up and call the arrangement certainty. If the self does not survive the bond, it is not love in Fromm's sense, no matter what it feels like. And the feeling is not evidence, because the feeling is the strongest exactly where the dissolution is most complete. That is a hard standard, and it disqualifies a great deal, including a great deal that is happy. Fromm is aware of this. His point is not that the disqualified arrangements are worthless. It is that they are solving the aloneness problem rather than the relating problem, and that people who have solved the aloneness problem stop looking, which is why the second problem is so rarely worked on. And work, in his definition, is creation, not employment, not productivity, not output. Creation in the sense of a person making something that did not exist and that has their fingerprints on it, and the exclusion is explicit, and it points straight back at Calvin. Never work as escape, never work as flight from aloneness. The activity has to be aimed at the thing being made and not at the feeling of the person making it, and the difference between the two is invisible from outside and completely obvious from inside, provided the person is willing to look, which is the condition that transparency was about. So that is the answer, and you can see immediately why it does not travel well. It is not a method. There are no steps. It cannot be started on a Monday. It cannot be measured, and it does not scale. What Fromm has actually described is a standard, and standards are much less comfortable to hold than programs, because a program can be completed and a standard just sits there. And then, having offered the artist as his example of the spontaneous life, Fromm does something that tells you more about his honesty than anything else in the book. He immediately takes it apart. The position of the artist, he writes, is vulnerable, and he explains why, in a sentence, that ought to be much better known. It is really only the successful artist whose individuality is respected. If he does not succeed in selling his art, he remains to his contemporaries a crank, a neurotic. Stop and look at what that does to the argument he has just made. He has spent the chapter telling you that the one thing worth having is activity that originates in you. He has offered the artist as the culture's model of it, and now he points out that the culture does not in fact respect that. What it respects is the outcome. The same work, the same origination, the same interior life produces a person we call an artist if it sells, and a person we call a crank if it does not. The quality being praised was never the origination. It was the sale. And then he generalizes it into one line that closes the whole subject. The successful revolutionary is a statesman. The unsuccessful one is a criminal. Same act, same conviction, same risk, taken by the same person for the same reasons. The verdict is assigned afterward by the result, and then read backwards into the character of the man, exactly the way A read his reasons backwards into his manuscript. Society's judgment of individuality is a rationalization that arrives post factum, which means the encouragement you are offered to be yourself is conditional in a way nobody states out loud. Be yourself, and if it works, you will be called original. Be yourself, and if it does not, you will be called difficult, unrealistic, a bit lost, someone who never quite found their footing. And every person weighing whether to originate something knows this without being told and prices it in, and mostly decides against and experiences that decision as prudence. That is the last turn of the screw, and Fromm puts it there deliberately because he does not want you leaving with the impression that the way out is socially available. It is not. The pattern is not enforced by an authority you could confront. It is enforced by the ambient judgment of everyone around you, which is anonymous authority doing its work one last time on the very act of escaping it. So what is his actual verdict on the situation? He gives it in one sentence, and it is the most precise diagnosis in the book. The cultural and political crisis of our day, he writes, is not due to the fact that there is too much individualism, but that what we believe to be individualism has become an empty shell. Not too much. An empty shell. That is a very specific claim, and it cuts against the reflex of every era, including ours. The complaint we are used to is that people have become too self-focused, too concerned with their own expression, too unwilling to submit to anything larger. Fromm says the diagnosis is exactly inverted. The problem is not the quantity of individualism. It is that the thing carrying the name has been hollowed out, and that the hollowing is invisible precisely because the shell is intact and highly decorated, and he gives the test, and it is the most quotable line he ever wrote, and also the least understood. The right to express our thoughts, he writes, means something only if we are able to have thoughts of our own. That is not a statement about censorship. Read it again. He is granting the right. The right is not in question. He is asking what the right is worth in a population whose thoughts arrive the way A's suspicion arrived, with the reasons assembled afterward. A perfectly free society of pseudo-selves would exhibit every visible sign of freedom, would defend those signs energetically, and would be transmitting patterns whose origin no participant could locate. Nothing would need to be suppressed. There would be nothing to suppress. And this is where the title of the book finally pays off, because Fromm's last structural claim is that this is not a stable arrangement. Freedom, he writes, has reached a critical point where, driven by the logic of its own dynamism, it threatens to change into its opposite. Driven by the logic of its own dynamism, not attacked from outside. not stolen. Freedom, doing exactly what freedom does, cutting ties, producing individuals, generating the aloneness that individuation costs, manufactures at scale the precise conditions under which large numbers of people will hand it back, and they will hand it back voluntarily, gratefully, and while describing the transaction as a choice, because that is what the three escapes are for, that is the argument complete. And it is the reason Fromm was able to look at 1,100 questionnaires in 1931 and tell you what a country would do in 1933. So we should finish honestly, and finishing honestly means declining to do the thing that this kind of video usually does at the end. I am not going to tell you that you are one of the rare ones who sees it. That offer is available. It is the obvious way to close. It would feel excellent, and it is the exact trap Fromm spent a whole chapter building the equipment to detect. If you have spent 2 hours learning that pseudo-mental acts are the rule and genuine ones the exception, and you arrive at the end of it feeling identified as an exception, then the material has been consumed rather than used, and the feeling of insight you have right now is the feeling A had about his manuscript. Fromm's claim, stated plainly, is that this is the normal condition of normal people in a modern society, not the damaged ones, the normal ones. That includes the person who made this video. There is no seat in the room from which this does not apply, and any account that offers you one is not describing Fromm, nor is there a cure on offer. And it is important that this is not false modesty on his part. It follows from the structure of the thing. A method for escaping the pseudo-self would have to be executed by the self that is available, and the self that is available is the one in question. What he offers instead is a direction and a standard, and the standard is the last line worth taking with you. The self, he writes, is as strong as it is active, and then the clause that carries it. Ours is only that to which we are genuinely related by our creative activity. Ours is only that. Not what we own, not what we are admired for, not the position, the credential, the following, the reputation, or the biography. Not even what we believe, since we have just spent an hour on where beliefs come from. Only the things you are genuinely related to by activity that started in you. And on that accounting, most of what a person would list if asked to describe themselves turns out not to be theirs at all, and a small number of things that would never make the list turn out to be the only entries. So here is what is actually left at the end of 2 hours, and it is deliberately small, not a program. One question, which you can ask about a single want at a time and which does not resolve. Where did this come from? Not is it good, not is it achievable, not does it feel like mine, because we established early that the feeling is manufacturable and proves nothing. Where did it come from? Who had it before I did? And what would I have to stop believing about myself in order to put it down? Most of the time, the answer will not arrive. That is normal, and it is not failure. Sometimes what arrives is the recognition that the reasons came second, that the wanting was there first, and the case for it was built afterward, at speed, out of materials you would never have assembled before. That recognition is unpleasant, and it does not fix anything. It is also, by Fromm's account, one of the exceptions. It is a genuine mental act, and there is no such thing as having enough of them. Think back to the decision at the start of this, the one you would describe, without hesitating, as your own. It may well be yours. Most of the time, Fromm is not asking you to conclude that it is not. He is asking for something much harder than a conclusion, which is that you hold it open a little longer than is comfortable before you file it, because the three escapes are not exotic, and they are not other people's, dissolving into something larger, removing what you cannot join. And the third one, the ordinary one, the one that requires nothing and looks like nothing and is chosen by the majority of normal individuals, which is simply becoming exactly what is expected, so completely and so early that no part of you is left standing outside it to notice. That last one has no symptoms. It never announces itself. It produces, in most cases, a decent and functional and reasonably contented life. And it is not weakness. That is the thing to leave with. It is a solution to a problem you did not invent that works, and that most people accept because the alternative is a kind of aloneness the human organism will do almost anything to avoid. Knowing that does not release you from it. Fromm never says it does. It just means that from here on, when you make the choice and it feels entirely like yours, some quiet part of the room stays unconvinced. That is not a cure, and it was never offered as one. It is, as far as Fromm could tell, the whole of what is available. And on his own accounting, it is enough to be going on with, because the self is as strong as it is active, and holding a question open is an activity.